Okay, so we're taking a little bit of a risk by actually using a quote. It's kind of an argument, but since it's not arguing our thesis, then it fits that I believe that it's okay to be in the introduction. Um, so you never wanna put a quote and an explication of the quote in the intro that belongs in the body as an actual argument of the thesis. But if there's a quote in that piece that introduces sort of the overarching theme of what that piece is about, it might behoove you to be very keen on um, introducing it in the intro. So let's set this up. I've set up the intro here, but I want to go over it first. It took me a little while. It wasn't just super quick. So in poets, as true genius is but rare, true taste as seldom is the critic share. So Alexander Pope declares not only that true genius among writers is indeed difficult to find anywhere, but also that it is equally difficult to find a literary critic who has good taste in literature. The blank poet, so I want to say some interesting detail about him. We could say, I think he was like short and like humpbacked. I remember there was an interesting description of him. So I don't know. We could say diminutive poet, short-statured poet, or the short-statured but big ideaed poet. Like in that vein, right? I'll figure out the phrase, but in that vein. But something that's an interesting adjective. I like to throw in good adjectives once in a while, not to go overboard with them, but it adds to the richness and the flavor of your writing. So you could even talk about the time period he writes in. The blank poet, Enlightenment poet, the Victorian poet. I mean, you know, um, So you could write one or two adjectives. The British Victorian poet, or the contemporary American poet. So, but just left it underlined there. We can fill that in later. The blank poet Alexander Pope is the progenitor, is the starter. I could have said creator. Creator of dozens of witticisms. He's not really. I guess he's the creator. But I just like progenitor. It's more of $1 million word. The word progeny comes from that, and progeny is like your kids, like your direct kids. So he is. I mean, he is the like origin. I guess you could say, he's the origin of dozens of witticisms. I mean, there's other words, but I just think progenitor is the right word that I would use here. Dozens of witticisms and one-liners that are still featured in the popular lexicon to this day. Again, lexicon, $100,000 word. It basically means like the specific like library compendium of language, So, the healthcare field has jargon and they have a lexicon. They have like a vocabulary in their field, and every field has a lexicon. The film world, the literary world, etc. So, but I'm just saying in the popular lexicon, which I was thinking about changing it, because what does that mean? Like, what's the question? Here's the other thing is, what is the question that is going to be asked after every sentence? So here, the reader's going to ask, what is this and where is it from? And why did you put this as your first line of the essay? And so you got to answer that immediately. I could have said this next, but witticisms and one-liners, yeah, but we haven't answered this. We haven't, is this what is this a one-liner? Are these witticisms? I don't know. You haven't explained it to me. Me being the writer. It's my responsibility to explain everything explicitly. So if I'm just gonna drop this and say, "Oh, this guy Alexander Pope writes all these great one-liners," I haven't answered the obvious question yet. So answer the obvious question from the reader as soon as possible. If you're ever stuck in terms of like what the next move is, what the next sentence should be, that's like 70% of it. 70% is going to be answer the obvious question that the reader's going to ask. Now, if you've already answered all those questions, and you have to keep in mind obviously, the length of your piece and all that stuff, but the other percentage, the other 30% is going to be, okay, well, this is the end of a paragraph, so you can go to the next paragraph, so you want to introduce the next one. But in general, by and large, you're going to have so many body sentences that need to be followed by subsequent sentences after that. So I'd say it's like 70%. And certainly the first sentence of an essay, you should answer that question. So first question is going to be, who said this? What does this mean? So let's answer it immediately. Alexander Pope declares not only that true genius among writers is indeed difficult to find anywhere, but also that it's equally difficult to find a literary critic who has good taste in literature. And this is essentially like bringing us into sort of the nuance. It's kind of like an onion. The overarching theme, we just stated it in a quote that he mentioned in his piece, right? And then we could even say, we'll just say Alexander Pope. We could say Victorian poet Alexander Pope, and then here we could change this. We can delete all that and just say Pope is the progenitor of dozens of witticisms. But yeah, all that like we could tweak a little bit here and there in editing. But we answered the main question. That's huge, and we also entered in to what our thesis is going to be about. You don't want to talk about something that's way over here, and then your thesis is like 100 miles away. You want to start pretty close to your thesis, so you have a way in. So the blank poet, or the poet Alexander Pope, is a progenitor of dozens of witticisms and one-liners that are still featured in the popular lexicon to this day. So this is also so they might be saying, okay, who is he and why are we talking about him, and obviously, what are these witticisms and one-liners? Well, and what am I going to learn about them? Well, I also want to get them excited. There's also an excitement when you mention that. You're like, oh, well, I'm excited to be able to read some of these. So we want to sort of you're kind of like selling the excitement as well, a little bit of the reader reading your paper. So they're going to be like, oh, cool. So I'm going to be able to see some of these cool witticisms and one-liners in this essay. So. And then boom, it's a hook. So one-liners, witticisms, boom. Many of these one-liners have to do with art and creativity. Well, let's just say, I don't even want to say, I would actually want to use a different word. So you could say many of these quips, right? Or you could say many of these pithy remarks. Let's just say quips. We might change the word. But again, to go back to one of my favorite things is to mix up the words to keep it interesting. Like, I don't want to say witticisms and one-liners and then say many of these witticisms and one-liners have to do with art. You don't want to repeat that. DRY, don't repeat yourself. Same thing with like coding that I've seen, and same thing with writing essays. I mean, it's interesting. You want to be efficient. I think efficiency is important as a student, but also it ends up being important in the workplace. With even time management and priorities and all of that stuff, and professional work. So it's the same thing here. It's efficiency, and it's being interesting. And part of being interesting is not repeating yourself over and over and over and over again, unless that's the point. If that's the point, then then that's a little different. But when you're writing an essay, generally, you don't want to do that. So many of these quips have to do with art and creativity, and more specifically, they oftentimes have to do with Pope's editorializing on these two aforementioned occupations. So I could have said on these occupations, period. But it's been a few sentences since I mentioned writers and critic, and I also want to tie down the reader's understanding. Not tie down the reader, but their understanding and being able to follow the essay. So sometimes, I guess I'd explain it would be you want to use the minimum number of words for 100% understanding. And so you need to use, but you need to use enough words so that there's true understanding. So yes, we could just like keep minimalizing all day long, and you could say on these occupations, period. And then you move on. Although he specifies guidelines, but it's a little bit vague. It's a little bit vague because we might have forgotten. We just got introduced to the writer and the critic. Now later on, if we've talked about the writer and the critic, 2 or 3 times, 4 or 5 times, then if we bring it up again, these two occupations, we're not going to say the writer and the critic. But since we just introduced, and this is very, very new, very, very fresh, it's in the introduction, and we've had a few sentences in between, it might be helpful for us to repeat them. Number one, the writer. Oh, no, here's a mistake. And number two, the literary critic. And this reminds me of an old movie, but a classic. I've probably seen this, 50 times. Is 2. So he says, his brother, Macaulay Culkin's brother says, 1, you're not that lucky or something. And he goes, B, and then D. It's just hilarious. He says, he's supposed to say like 1, 2, and 3. There's 3 reasons, 1, 2, and 3. And he goes like 1, 2, and D, or 1, B, and D. It's hilarious. This is sort of the same thing, right? You could say these 2 aforementioned occupations. You don't want to go like A and C. But I wouldn't want to do A and B either. If you use the number 2 in an essay, by and large, if you're going to number them, put the numbers 1 and 2. It's just a little bit easier for the reader to follow you, even if they're reading quickly. It's another thing too, is you want them to be able to follow you, even if they're reading quickly. So yeah, I think that's good. I think it's decent. Although and then here it is, our thesis. Hopefully you read it. Or you were able to point it out. Although he shares specific guidelines for how one might become a great literary critic, Pope, we already know Pope, so we don't have to say Victorian writer Alexander Pope. We could say Alexander again, but we could use Alexander again, but we don't have to here. I don't believe. Some teachers say if you're going to have your thesis, you should use the full name of the author, the full name of the work, indeed. But the full name of the author, I don't. I think it all depends. That might be some question. That one teacher might say yeah, and the other teacher might say it doesn't matter if it flows. I think most teachers would say if it flows in the essay, then you don't have to use the full name. Pope deploys rhyme and word choice in order to malign the critic much more harshly than he does the writer in parts 1 and 2 of his An Essay on Criticism. Now, even though this is a little bit awkward, his and an of an essay, because it's still preposition. Or this is more of a possessive adjective, really. But it's fine. I mean, this is the title of his work, so of his blank, and you might even say of his poem, An Essay on Criticism. But you don't have to say poem, because in the title it says the word essay. So you might as well just say of his, An Essay on Criticism. You could also say his essay, An Essay on Criticism. Put that comma there. But I just think it's extraneous. So these are small editorial opinions, but I think this is a good first paragraph. And the last sentence of the first paragraph, usually that's not bad, especially for like a regular literary essay for high school or college. And a lot of, we might want to say, oh, well, this essay will cover this and that. If there's something special that you need to point out, like, oh, I think before I mentioned that the essay is going to be chronological. So for the Walt Whitman poem, I talked about chronological. But you don't have to do that for every single one, and I actually don't recommend you doing it for every single one. I actually don't even like saying this essay will blank. in the first paragraph. Some teachers actually won't even let you turn the paper in for a good grade. I mean, they'll like spend half a class and explain. It's like a pet peeve. So every teacher sort of has a pet peeve, especially with writing and whatnot. So you want to figure out like what those pet peeves are. Most teachers, I think, are pretty understanding if it's done well. Like you can say this essay blank if it's done well. If you're a hardworking student and etc. And you do it well, then it's not going to look as bad as if every piece of evidence in your writing suggests that you're lazy or that you choose to go the lazy route or the less thoughtful route or just a less sophisticated route, a less interesting route. Because it's less interesting if you just keep saying this essay will blank, and you don't want to say I. You never want to say I, and everyone knows that, but you rarely want to say I. Maybe in the conclusion, maybe if you're writing about history, if you're comparing it to yourself, but there's got to be a really good reason. And definitely when you're talking about literature, you know, if it's a formal essay, you generally don't want to. So those are some of the main reasons why I chose to write this paragraph as it is. Let's connect next time for the next paragraph. Okay, thank you very much.